First of all, I'd just like to say thank you very much for having a slot at 9 o'clock on the first day. Being a data person who works in an insurance company, I normally get the slot at 4:30 on the last day, and it's normally just me and the AV guy left in the room, so it's nice to see people in front of me as I speak. Right, probably could be the world's shortest presentation, as just been alluded to. Can big data make customer insight easier? Well, I'm going to hopefully try and span out the next 30 minutes and explain that there might be some gold in the riverbed that is big data. So I work at Aviva, and for those of you who aren't from the UK or live under a rock or don't own a TV or have never bought insurance, and this is who we are. We are the 6th largest insurance company in the world. We operate in 16 countries. We have about 34 million customers worldwide. We're the largest insurance company in the UK. Since we've merged with Friends Life, we've got about 17 million customers in the UK. And we've been around for a long time, 300 years. I think some of our IT is still from that original period, though that's not proved. We are moving into digital, and with moving into digital, that has forced us as an organisation to take the concept of big data seriously. And for those of you who've been watching, I'm sure, our brilliant new Good Thinking ads, you'll realise that we are desperately trying to engage with our customers in a different way. So the driving challenge that's on your TVs at the moment, focusing around our Aviva Drive app, with a view to ultimately get people to interact with us digitally. And we've built a digital portal for all our customers, and that is those interactions across that portal, which is where big data and my role is having so much fun at this moment in time. We sponsor Premiership Rugby, and apologies if there's any Middlesbrough fans in the room. We got promoted to the Premiership just down the road in May when we sponsored Norwich City Football Club. Right, so my agenda, you're probably thinking, how the hell are you going to finish half an hour talking about big data and insight? So I think it's probably just a good idea, just before we kind of go through the whole question about what makes good insight and does big data help, is just try to actually go through this journey. So what do we mean by granular insight? What is big data? I imagine there's 50, 60 people in the room. There's probably 50, 60 definitions of what big data is in this room. What are the insight challenges? We're going to talk about the rogue Vs. There seems to be a new V associated with big data every time you open an article. The changes in your business and what are the data sources you should be kind of looking at. And I'm going to put a list up. If you aren't looking at some of the data sources that I list, then you really need to be thinking about why, or maybe you know why, and you're a step ahead of me. There's an interesting thing about big data. So traditionally, we all probably sat on very structured databases with SAS, maybe SPSS, KXEN as our tools of choice, and now you're talking about things called Hadoop and Cloudera and Python and R, and you're thinking, actually, do we do the same things in that? So I'm just going to talk you through some of the different data techniques that you probably need to be thinking about having in your teams or being aware of, or at least knowing a consultant who can do it. And then in terms of how we grow, I think as we just talked about, I think we are right at the beginning of big data, and I think this is the hit, miss, maybe period. I think as an industry, we've got to really work out actually what the value is in it, and then once you've decided what that value chain looks like, how do you grow your organisation around it? So in terms of organisations, what we're trying to achieve, well, although I don't look it, graduated from university in the mid-90s, which is actually when the concept of big data was first talked about. I went off and did a marketing degree because I didn't really want to work hard for a career. And my tutor at the time said, what all organisations are trying to do, the bigger they get, is to be this, to be a corner shop. You have to understand your customers as well as the guy who runs the corner shop. So when somebody comes in, you recognise who they are, you remember what was the last thing they purchased, you know the relationship with the person who came in before, and you can have a chat to them, and as a result, a bit like Arkwright in Open All Hours, you sell them another tin of beans when they only came in for washing powder. So we as organisations are trying to replicate corner shops, and I like this graphic because it shows a corner shop set up in kind of Amazon style. The definition on this, the quotation on the side is from Jodie Pickles, which I thought was absolutely brilliant. We sit in my team spending a lot of time saying what's the next thing that you should do with us as an organisation based on what I believe is correct. And I think the quotation, you only figure that the only way I'll be happy is if I did the things you thought would be best for me. What we have to do as organizations is move from talking to our customers to having conversations with them. And big data gives you the ability to talk, but also to listen to your customers. I'm now on to the next slide, and you're thinking, does he only do cartoons? Best definition of big data, I am ultimately a geek, so therefore Dilbert is still my mantra, and this is still one of my favourite definitions or discussions about big data. And I think there's probably also a lot of organisations who still have that as the reason why they commission big data projects. So in terms of big data, just to give you kind of a potted history, as I said, I graduated in the, let's say, the mid-90s. It sounds much better than the early 90s. And big data was just being discussed as an entity. Now, at that time, we had something in the corner of our office called a Winchester disk. I don't know if anyone remembers those. You used to have the little 3.5mm discs that you put in your disk drive. And a Winchester disk had 30 megabytes. And I remember when you got permission to go and use the computer that was attached to the Winchester disk, you were probably doing big data in those days. We then did a piece of work with a company called Hart Hanks, and we installed a 1 terabyte database. We took the voters roll from Experian, who were called CCN in those days, and built a terabyte installation. We called that a big data base in those days. I can buy a terabyte for 29 quid from John Lewis today. So it just shows how much it's moved on. So I think Laney is probably described as being the person who's done the archetypal definition of big data. And he talks about 3 dimensions, now known as the 3 Vs, although as we'll talk later, some other Vs have appeared. About volume, variety, and velocity. And these are dimensions that historically traditional databases haven't been able to hold. So in volumes, there is probably a new prefix for the word byte that exists every day. So we've gone to petabyte, texabytes, hexabytes. I'm sure there's another byte out there that somebody in California has come out with. And it's all terabytes to the power of 10 to the 24 to the power of something else. So volume. So if you think about the volume of data in terms of interactions, and I'm sure somebody will put it through, there are supposed to be, if you take large internet tradings, over like 20 petabytes of data a minute goes through the internet just from UK IPs. Variety, we are talking about a load of data that historically we didn't have. So I run a marketing database. 5 years ago, all I had to have was contract engine information. What products had you bought? When did they expire? How much do you pay each month? And I might have some information that says, I can talk to you from marketing, and this is the last marketing communication I sent out. Now I have to know every time you've clicked and hit my website. I have to know who your friends are on Facebook, what your Twitter handle is, what device you have, what operating system you operate on, when you're most likely to click through on emails. All data that historically, I mean, just even finding a way to store it is probably more interesting. So what we are hopefully trying to find is big data of high volume, high velocity, and high variety that gives you an insight to customers. And I think most organizations would say that they are customer-centric. I bet if I read the manifestos, the brand charters, the values and vision statements of all your organizations, read your chairman's remarks, he would say that he is customer-centric. Well, if he isn't data-centric, he can't be customer-centric. All organizations have to have data centricity as part of their organizational DNA. You have to be able to, as an organization, understand every interaction, good, positive, that a customer or a potential customer has with you as an organization. And that is what big data gives you the opportunity to see. That's where the potential for insight comes from. So if I use an example, if you look at traditional data methods, and you were a football commentator, you would have your back to the match and you would just watch as a ball went into the back of the net. That is historically how we have managed stuff when we've said, something's going on over here, we don't know, we only know when it hits the net. So if you are trying to change what happens on the pitch, you need to be able to turn around and see everything that's happened that leads up to that goal. Big data gives you the opportunity to explore your ecosystem to understand what all those interactions are. So this was a review of what everybody thought big data meant. So when people talk about big data, they just say, oh, it's about new data sources. So there seems to be a huge correlation between social media data and big data. It's one source. A lot of people say it's about changing the way you store data. What's really interesting, in most big data instances, and there are lots of tech guys in the room who will be able to explain this better than me, most large big data instances will have like a washdown database. So historically, you grabbed hold of data and you stored it for as long as your audit and compliance team would allow you to. Now, for quite a lot of your data sources, you might wash them down every 24 hours. You might turn that data into a flag, and then you might turn the flag onto your repository database. But in terms of some of that initial data, you probably will use a MapReduce function, create some flags, create some triggers, push them down into your repository database, and probably wash down the transactions that you've hit that day. So the other things about new technology. So one of the huge things to think about, I have a database that sits on Teradata. It's about 4 terabytes. We have a Hadoop instance, which is about 250 terabytes. We are more likely to fill up our Hadoop instance than we are our Teradata instance because of the type of data that we're pushing in. The volume and variety is huge. So volume and variety, we could only have 3 Vs. And for anyone who's worked in marketing and remembers the 4 Ps that then became the 5 Ps, that then became the 7 Ps and the 8 Ps, we have done the same with Vs. We are not content with having only 3 Vs. And as I call them, the rogue 3 Vs have come in. And I think the 3 Vs have come in to try and act almost as a tempering our enthusiasm. So the new 3 Vs are veracity, variability, and value. And for the sake of anyone who doesn't know, for everyone who does, you can just look smug and play on the app. I'll just talk you through what we're talking about in veracity. One of the things about veracity, it's an IBM phrase. And when they first started on their big data instances, what they found is that the quality of data and how reliable it is in some of the sources isn't great. So social media sentiment analysis, it's shown to be less reliable than other sources. Variability. So some of the data sources, you have huge variety in your curve. So you'll have text data is a classic example. You might have a conversation with somebody where you have like 120 characters of text. You might have a conversation with somebody where you've got 2,000 lines of text. So it's quite hard to have constants across. And then the other one is value. So there is a phrase about low value density. Anyone who works in the world of data, you do not store low value density data on your systems. And what that means is, if you think about the classic example of panning for gold, amongst that tray of grit, there will be a gold nugget. You don't hold the grit, you only try and hold the gold. If you looked at that data as an entity, you would say that across the riverbed, it's low value density for gold because there's only a couple of nuggets of gold on that riverbed. What big data storage allows us to do, and as I said, the washdown repositories allows us to do that skimming out of the lower value data and making sure that we only pass the data that can drive insight forward. And I think if I sat here or stood here in a year's time, and that's not a request, there will probably be another 3 Vs that will come out because somebody will have tried a new big data experiment, something will have come out, and they will come out with a new V to describe why it is. So, big data sources. As I said, you have to be data-centric. If you want to drive genuine customer insight, you have to look at the new data sources that big data allows you to interact with in a way that you've never done before. So I worked at a company called MBNA, now Bank of America. We used to interact with call data, and we did that because we all sat in a room for an hour and we listened to people taking calls. And from that, we gained an insight into how customers felt about the quality of service that they've got. That was the only way you could interact with voice in 1995. Now, if you have a big data instance, it is very, very easy to plug in adapters that do voice to text, text reduction, and then analysis off the back of that. So you can take every conversation you've had with a customer and you can turn it into a data source to drive insight. Text fields. So at this moment in time, I'm sure you all have systems where you key data in, or your frontline staff do, or people who operate on your systems do. And that data is probably where all the insight is. That will tell you how likely the person is the next time you speak to them to want to buy, to want to renew, to want to cancel, whatever those outcomes are. Most organizations don't use contact center information as sources of data. Big data allows you to effectively manufacture that data into the potential for insight. And I use the word potential deliberately. Social data. So most organizations have sites on Facebook where people can follow and like their organization. There are 125,000 people who like Aviva. Not sure what we should do with those people. Mental Health Act springs to mind. But we have people who like the rugby. We have people who like Norwich City. And a large number of organizations have used Facebook as a way to engage audiences in a way that they never have before. Historically, Facebook has been a closed shop. So you go in, you talk to people in Facebook, and it's very hard as an organization to take that data down. There are lots of systems that you can interact with Facebook and other social media things such as Twitter, and then you take that data down into your organization and analyze that data for the potential for insight. I work in insurance. Our big area at this moment in time is sensor data. So I'll talk about the Internet of Things in the minute, but driverless cars. There is a trial live in the UK at the moment. There's 4 cities that are trialling driverless cars. Driverless cars have been in America for a long time. Even mainstream manufactured cars are using elements of driverless cars in sensors that they're putting into their vehicles, assisted braking, deceleration, etc. So I think over time, sensor data, which probably at this moment, because I come from Norfolk, seems a bit futuristic, will become commonplace. And it can be something as mundane as a sensor on a water pipe for us in insurance that says water pressure's gone down. And if water pressure goes down, it means there's probably a leak somewhere, and then we can just cut the supply to the house to reduce flooding. I know that the manufacturers of Tide are talking about having sensors that tell you when your soap powder's running out, or your fridge tells you when you've run out of Coke, and all this wonderful thing. Geolocation data. So as an organization, it's really important that you understand lots of things about people, who they are, what's motivating them, but also where they are. So if I work in, for example, a coffee, if I worked for Costa or Starbucks and I want to send a push notification to a customer to say, go and have a coffee or 50p off a coffee, it would be really useful that I sent that as a push notification, and from that I sent them the directions to where the nearest coffee shop of my franchise was. Geolocation data is good not only for doing the call to action, but to understand stuff. So you might find this crazy. In Aviva and in all insurance companies, we have people who put their cars at a location that they don't live, mainly students. So somebody might go and have a course, let's say North London somewhere, and they're in a university in London. Their parents live in a very nice, sleepy suburb of Hampshire. The car insurance where their parents are is about £100, £200 cheaper than where it is at university. They will tell us that they are living at their parents' house. If we had a sensor, we'd be able to say that even though they say that their car is parked on the drive at 1 the Avenues in Hampshire every night, I know it's outside 21 the Street in London, and that's where it lives, and that's where it takes. So does that mean that I can have a conversation with them about maybe they haven't been as honest as they need to be on their insurance? Biometric data, we have a health business, we have a life insurance business. Biometric data is going to be really, really important. And I think going forward, there are going to be people who buy into biometric data, and I think there are people who will kind of opt out from it. This might be used from something as simple. I mean, most people here have probably got some form of iPhone device, Apple device, and you use a thumbprint to get in. That is a very accessible version of biometric data being used. So the sensor that reads and scans and understands your thumbprint or fingerprint, whichever one you use, is using an algorithm that's based on biometric data. So we also have semi-structured data that is available, so web journey data. So as I said, in Aviva, we are very much moving into the digital world. So for us, structured data is really important. And the key insights we're always trying to understand is, what are the journeys that lead you to come to make a purchase at Aviva? So understanding as much, turning our backs from the goal, looking out over the pitch and saying, what was it that you did yesterday? What was it we did to you 3 weeks ago that's meant you've come to our shop today to buy something? And as organisations, there is the adage, which is probably even truer now, which is, I know 5% of my marketing works. The problem is I don't know which 5% it is. Big data doesn't help you vastly. It just gives you other dimensions by which you don't really understand which 5% of your data works as well. Call logs we've talked about, but this is different to the conversation around what people are actually saying. It's understanding how many times people interact. Organisationally, there are many things that hold to be true, and we have seen that the number of times people interact over certain periods significantly drives and changes their behaviour to other people in a cohort. So if you know, as an organisation, that a customer who comes in and talks to you 5 times around a key period on a product is more likely not to renew that product or to cancel it, that is a flag as an organisation you should react to. Now, until we have big data stores where we can do number of times customers contacted us, we never stored that because it didn't appear on any of our contract engines. So now we can do churn modelling, we can do retention modelling based on customers' interactions with us as an organisation. And then I put in transaction data. So if you are sitting here as a large internet retailer, your transaction data is big data. So I'm just going to ask a strange question. How many people know that you are here today? How many people you told a significant other, might be home late tonight, I'm living it up at Wembley with the rest of the customer analytics and insight crowd in the UK. Might tell your children because, you know, granny or next door neighbour's going to pick them up and do the school run. Anyone would say maybe less than 5 people you've told? Would that be probably about right? You're all lying. And the reason is because you've probably told every single one of these where you are today. So for those who are more socially enabled than I, these are social media icons. So in this room today, I would say on average there are 25 to 30 apps on your phone that know where you are today. So you might not have told your parents where you are today, but Cafe Nero probably knows where you are today, or Blockbuster would know where you are today, or Uber knows where you are today, or Halo does, or some other entity. And what this means is that whether or not we know or understand it, we are generating ourselves tons and tons of data items. And people don't realize it, and this data is out there. And at the moment, there's a huge debate, I think, as an industry in the analytics and insight community about the ethical responsibilities we have towards the data sources that are available to us. Because what we are seeing more and more is that data that used to be public, that used to be very private, is now effectively open source data. It is very, very easy now to look at data that historically I wouldn't know. And I'll give you a really interesting example. We have an ethical policy within Aviva. We are very, very mindful of how we use data. And one of the things that we always debate about is if we access someone's Facebook account and we looked at that data, what could we do with it? We don't. It's just an example. So one of the examples is you post on your Facebook account today, fantastic, just booked my holiday. This is a key period where people book holidays, 2 key periods in a year, January and June. People who haven't spent a lot of money over Christmas, or maybe did and are just desperate to find the sun. And then the people in June who think, God, we need a holiday, and then rush out and buy one from last minute. You post that. So do I use that as a sales flag to say, would you like travel insurance? Or do I use it in 7 months' time when your house gets burgled to say, well, you actually just told 125,000 people that your house was going to be left empty for 2 weeks? We don't take Facebook data or comment data off Facebook into our organisation, but they're the sorts of things that ethically you really need to think about. It's very, very easy from Facebook data to infer religious beliefs, sexual orientation, political affinities. All of these things are deemed as being sensitive data, and you need to be really, really comfortable and very careful about the sort of data you expose your organisation to. Because one of the interesting things about big data is it does expose great data for insight, but some of that data you really have to question yourself as an analyst whether or not you should be able to see it and whether or not you should be able to use it. Internet of Things is also coming, the talking kettle, as we like to call it. So at this moment in time, there are about 8.7 billion devices connected to the internet in homes. There are Hive is probably the most publicly recognised example in the UK. There are, at this moment in time, devices where if you leave the house and you think, did I remember to lock the bathroom window? You can lock the bathroom window from an app on your phone because you can have internet locks on your windows. You can have lights that I remember I used to get plugs that used to have like a clock on it, and you used to push and said, can you pretend that the lights are going to come on between 7 and 9? And when it went through the 7 and 9, automatically the light switch came on. You can now do that from your home. You can control your lights. Going forward, devices in appliances and devices in everyday life are going to be commonplace. And we're going to use them as organisations to understand things like the wear and warranty issues on products. Consumers will use them for ease, and somewhere an analyst will use them for a different purpose. Cisco thinks that by 2020, which, if my maths is great, is 4 years, there's going to be 50 billion devices. Morgan Stanley think there's going to be 75 billion devices. So whichever number you believe, the number's only going in one direction, and that's up massively. Now, I'm not very good at maths, which is strange because I'm an analyst. The belief is that those devices per day will be generating 50 trillion gigabytes of data a day, just on these devices. That is huge. There's going to be more sensors in objects than there are going to be people on the planet, 28 times. So there's going to be more sensors than there are people. So are sensors the new insects? I'm not sure. So as you go into big data, and we talked about the new data sources, to drive your insight, this is what you need. So historically, if I did analytics in an insurance company, I needed people who understood things like mortality rate for life products. I needed people who understood claims frequencies for car insurance. I now need to employ 22-year-olds who understand what Twitters are and things, and that I just sound like a dad at a disco every time I talk to them. But there are huge and different techniques that you need to go into. Predictive modeling still has a role, but there are different types of techniques, and I could probably spend half an hour just on these, and that might be a conversation in one of the breakouts in one of your sessions. So the types of pre-data prep that you need to do on voice is huge. So most analysts, if anyone here has ever cut code in SAS, will know that before you get to cutting the code in SAS, you've probably spent 6 weeks getting rid of outliers, random data items. Interesting thing about big data is the outliers become the interesting things that you try and model. Gone are the days where you go and find 20,000 white mice that match the hypotheses that you're trying to prove, and you spend all your time getting rid of everybody else, and you come out with a model and it's really good, but it only actually applies to 60% of your base, and 40% you can't score because they don't meet the criteria of your model. Big data allows you to do different techniques, and what it allows you to do is take everybody in, and you can look at the outliers and say, actually, is the outlier weird, or is the outlier what we actually want to happen, and what made the outlier the outlier? So maybe big data is more inclusive. So outliers no longer have to sit in the discarded data files of modelers. You also need new tools. One of the interesting things is it's really hard to do tables to try and explain big data. So visualization tools are a really good way to start looking at your insights. So I'm not promoting any of them. I'm going to say all other products are available. So Click, Tableau, TIBCO, Spotify, SAS, Visualization Studio. All of these types of products where you can throw data in, where they already have connectors in and easily map out this data, scatter plots, presenting data in a way that you wouldn't have had to in the past, are really important because they're going to show you what those initial insights are. You will be able to throw dimensions together in ways you haven't done before, drill down in ways you haven't done before, and said, hang on, there shouldn't be a relationship between these two things. That also leads you on to the interesting thing is how quickly you make judgments. So inference and insight is also a huge thing. The adage of every time I go out, I see a red car, it rains. That doesn't mean to say the red car has caused the rain. It's just a correlation. So the other thing you have to be really careful is around your rigor. Because when you get into the world of big data, you are throwing so many points at it, you almost can, by default, always find correlations. You do need new tools. I talked about Big Data Store, including temporary repositories. You will wash down data. You will not hold on to all the data you use for modeling. You will need next-generation modeling tools, so Revolution R, Python, I know SAS, and others are now doing big data versions. Having people who understand critical path and graphing, understanding map reduction techniques, people who understand how to pull structured data into a semi-structured way for initial data store and then push it into a structured data store, really important. And I put data schema in a question mark. I've worked on many big data projects, and we always start off with, and everyone goes, this is great, we're not going to be governed by a schema. You always end up having a schema in your data because you have to have a bucket to put things in, especially when you move it down into the more structured way. So it's not the Wild West where there's no structure in your data. It's like this. There are tables. There are people sitting in some form of correlation. But what there is 1,000 lines between them all in a way that traditional data sets don't have. So does it make easier insight? Well, I think it actually asks you different things. It's not a silver bullet. Well, at least it hasn't been for us as an organization today, and that is probably for a number of reasons. Probably we haven't found the right data. We probably haven't found the right question. And I think that's really important. Big data is another source of data. So what does it enable you to do? Well, it enables you to add the same questions with new data. And we've seen huge model uplifts by finding new factors from looking at big data. Doesn't necessarily explain stuff better. It just makes us more accurate at predicting what happens. We've tried new techniques. We've used different techniques within our repository software, and we found uplifts because of that, because we've looked at outliers, because we've looked at the whole thing. We have started to ask new questions, but I actually think that's where the big data gold is going to be. You're going to be able to ask questions of the organization that you probably, as organizations and your stakeholders, don't know what to ask. And I think it's as much, when I talked about people being data-centric, it's not just about how you store data and think. You now need to change your mindset, because questions that you couldn't ask 5 years ago, what was all the things that John Smith did before John Smith bought this insurance product? And I could have said 5 years ago, well, they bought it on the web, and we sent them a marketing communication 2 weeks ago, and we think that's the only thing that they've had. Now I can say every single journey that they did on all of our websites that led up to that. So we now have far more granular insights. And I think we've seen somewhere in the region of a 15-20% performance increase in the upper deciles of our models. So in terms of, does it make it easier? I'll just come back because obviously I don't want you to thank me just yet. I think it does make it easier when you find the right question. The biggest insight in big data is making sure as an organization you know what the right question is. I'm going to say now thank you very much, because I think I'm now just on time. So thank you very much indeed for your time this morning, guys.
Very good, very good.